Hello friends. The United States and China continue to be locked in a diplomatic row. It's also political as well as economic. Both countries continue to exchange harsh statements, trade allegations, and keep peddling their own respective narratives wherever there is an opportunity. The latest such occasion was the security conference at the German town Munich around 18th-19th of February. Here, Foreign Secretary Antony Blinken as well as the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi maintained their usual positions on each other. China has been sort of neutral in the conflict of Ukraine, whereas the United States and its allied countries have been really harsh, coming down hard on Russia and consider China as to be the silent partner of the Russian Federation. Now, during the conference, speeches, statements, and post-interview press conferences or post-event press conferences also witnessed similar exchanges in which both countries were basically exchanging allegations as well as hard positions on Ukraine, on climate, on security, with the Chinese officials basically suggesting that Europe shall have to consider as to how long does it want to go along the United States. Now, on one of the occasions, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi also suggested that the United States has a misguided, what he said, misguided perception of China and it needs to be corrected. So to discuss this, the China-US relationship, we have with us Adam Weinstein. He is a research fellow, a keen observer of the region, and is also associated with the Quincy Institute, Washington. I asked him as to how should we assess the US approach in general to China. What does he think of how US should be dealing with China?
Well, look, I think some of the development China does in Africa and even in Pakistan is, perhaps more in the interest of China than in the recipient countries. But at the same time, it can't be denied that China has improved the lives of Pakistanis. China has improved the lives in developing countries. A lot of Pakistani homes have electricity because of China. Lahore has a metro system because of China. These are things that are very obvious. The infrastructure that China has created that really changes people's lives in Pakistan is obvious for anyone who visits. And I don't think that the United States should be threatened by that. And if the United States is threatened by that, then it needs to offer an alternative. You can't go to people. Washington loves to do this. Washington loves to say, hey, why are you so close to China? Why are you accepting Chinese infrastructure development? They're taking advantage of you. And then the recipient country will say, okay, well, do you have an idea? Do you have an alternative? And Washington says, well, we don't do infrastructure. So you can't do that. You have to offer an alternative. And if you don't offer an alternative, then of course these countries in the global south are going to take advantage of what China has to offer.
Adam, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi also said, and it was very unusual, that US has a misguided perception of China and that it needs to demonstrate sincerity as well as resolve the damage that the United States has done in relations with China. So what do you make of it?
Well, look, the United States does engage in unilateralism. That's undeniable. I think both China and the United States have a misconception about one another. China says some very negative things about the United States on the world stage that I don't think are necessarily true. And so does Washington about China. I think China is a reality that Washington has to accept in the sense that it's a country of 1 billion people. and its rise to some degree is inevitable. Ultimately, I think China is either, China's destiny, and I'm not an expert on China by any means, but China's destiny is ultimately going to be most impacted by China, not the United States. I mean, an example of that is, I would argue that they mismanaged the COVID epidemic, and it cost their economy and it cost their reputation. And that was completely self-inflicted by China rather than United States tariffs or anything like that. I think what's important for both countries to do is to look for as many avenues in which they can cooperate, or at least not disrupt one another, as possible. Now, that's easier said than done.
Another question that needs a clarification or an honest answer from observers is whether the United States is deploying geopolitical exceptionalism when it comes to dealing with the issue of human rights, both in India as well as in China. Because if we look at the way the non-Hindu minorities of India have been suffering in the last 4 or 5 years, there's hardly any mention in the Western media, in the US media, of those violations, whereas the human rights violations in the Western Muslim-dominated Xinjiang province of China remains a very hot subject.
Well, I think the United States tends to do this in general about human rights, and for example, will openly criticize Iran's regime for human rights violations, but we're very hesitant to say things about Saudi Arabia, and in some cases we're even complicit in their human rights violations, using Yemen as an example. That's just one example outside of China. I do think what China has done in Xinjiang is unconscionable, and I'll be clear about that. But I think it's also true that at times the United States has not taken a hard enough stance about what is happening in Kashmir and what's happening to Indian Muslims throughout the country. And I think it's disturbing to see the world's largest democracy move in a right-wing direction that is stripping rights away from its largest religious minority, which is the Muslim population. So that is troubling. I think the United States should be more consistent about human rights. I think we should call out all human rights violations.
Let's turn to Afghanistan. This has been embattled from where the United States left abruptly in August 2021, paving way for the return of the Afghan Taliban. But the problems inside Afghanistan continue to engage and keep the international diplomacy busy. Now, do you think that Afghanistan can serve as a common bond among all the stakeholders, including the United States, Russia, China, India, and Pakistan?
There's a convergence of interests in Afghanistan. All of these countries, China, Russia, the United States, even India and Pakistan, face a threat from the rise of ISKP, from whatever freedom of movement Al-Qaeda has. TTP, for now, is only a threat to Pakistan, perhaps, but it has the potential to be a transnational threat. And certainly TTP has a close relationship with Al-Qaeda historically, so this should be of a concern to the United States. There's also ETIM, which of course is a concern for China. All of these groups are interrelated in some way. And so Afghanistan, ironically, is one place where I think there's a convergence of interests.
Adam, there's been a lot of talk about terrorism in Pakistan, about Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP. What are your views as an analyst, as a researcher on this terrorist entity? Is it a genuine entity dreaming of establishing its caliphate in Pakistan or in Afghanistan, or a proxy terrorist group that only uses the Islamist idealism, Islamist objectives as espoused by Al-Qaeda to justify its violence across Pakistan?
Well, I'm conflicted about this issue because sometimes I think, why do we spend so much time talking about these groups? We should just be talking about climate change. It wouldn't be irrational if all we ever did was talk about climate change, because that's the most existential threat to all of us right now. You could say that the most existential threat to Pakistan is not terrorism, it's the economy. And perhaps we should be focusing only on economic issues when it comes to Pakistan. But yet these groups have an ability to erode morale in society. I mean, that a TTP attack in Karachi and Sadr, for example, I think it only killed a couple police officers. In the grand scheme of things, that's a very low casualty. Now, not for their families, of course, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a low number. But it deters foreign investment. It deters people from coming to Pakistan. Its net effect is much larger. And the TTP have been quite shrewd in targeting the police because they've chosen a target that I'd say most Pakistanis are not extremely sympathetic to the police. They might not want to see them murdered, but this is a target that's not going to elicit the mass sympathy of the country, as opposed to if they targeted children, if they targeted civilians. I think they learned from the APS attack what their limits are, so they're being very focused on the police. And the aim of this is to send the message to the Pakistani population, look, your government can't even control us. If your police can't protect themselves, how can they protect you? And it's to demoralize Pakistani society while focusing on the police. Now, obviously, I think Pakistan and Afghanistan are two very different countries. It's an impossibility that TTP could take over Pakistan. That simply won't happen. But what they can do is demoralize the society.
Adam, the way you describe the TTP, it does then, in a way, amount to an existential threat to Pakistan, the way the TTP is hurting the interests of Pakistan. And that is basically obstructing foreign investment, making the business environment difficult for the investors, and also preventing peace, basically keeping the country on the boil. So doesn't that amount to basically an existential threat?
Well, maybe a slow-moving existential threat, but the primary thing the primary dysfunction stopping foreign investment and internal development and productivity in this country is actually not the security situation. That's a secondary issue. The primary issue is lack of ease of doing business, the fact that there's not productive industry, the fact, why is the real estate sector so big, as an example? This produces nothing. Corruption and things like this. This has held back Pakistan, and you could say that, okay, what is actually an existential threat to Pakistan? Lack of economic development and a rapidly growing population. That's an existential threat. And even in terms of climate change and climate resiliency, the lack of development has resulted in greater deaths from that. Now, of course, I'm not excusing the international community from that either. But these things have to change, and I worry that sometimes Pakistani elites use insecurity as an excuse for not making the kinds of changes that the IMF has demanded. I mean, you saw the IMF say the other day I think it was a question that Musharraf Zaidi had asked, the answer from the IMF is very clear. You need to pay taxes. We're not going to subsidize the elites in this country, and that's been the message. So I think Pakistan should hear that message loud and clear. We have to remember, look, Pakistan does face a unique terrorism situation, and it has been a victim of terrorism, and I'm very sympathetic to that. But at the same time, look, the United States has tens of thousands of gun violence deaths every year. The United States has mass shootings. There's other countries in the world with high insecurity that, in Latin America, Brazil has high insecurity, that have managed to develop and attract investment. And Pakistan can do the same thing. It will be a gift to the TTP if the Pakistani elites say, well, look at this insecurity, we have to solve this first before we can develop our economy. No, develop your economy, and some of these things with insecurity will work themselves out. But you can't bring the country to a standstill and put development on hold while you try to resolve a terrorism issue that could last for years.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. You are perfectly right when you say that Pakistan essentially needs to look inwards. It has to do a lot. It has to go a long way in creating conditions that encourage investment, that promote businesses, and do a lot of it itself rather than holding external factors as well as non-state actors such as TTP responsible for the present situation. And that the TTP or any other terror group should not be used as a justification for not recalibrating Pakistan's economic business models, for not creating an ease of doing business conditions in Pakistan. So that way, a lot depends on Pakistani institutions, Pakistani authorities themselves, rather than just pointing fingers to the others, because once things inside Pakistan improve, once Pakistan embraces smart technologies and tries to do business and facilitate business as well as investment, it can automatically take care of all the external factors that are serving as the fault lines, as the facilitators of exploitation of the fault lines within Pakistan. Thank you very much.